Let's pivot to this accelerating mental health crisis that we are reading about, we are experiencing. Every single one of us, Lisa, I don't have a single friend who doesn't have a family member who is spiraling. And all through the kind of lockdown and, coming out of the last 3 years, it doesn't feel like a new normal. It feels like there is something that's been bubbling underneath the surface. And if it hasn't already erupted with the young people in your life, it feels like everybody is very tender and that there is something going on beneath the surface. And so I would love for you to talk about what you've seen and what your concerns are about what and how this age group, 11 to 25 roughly, experienced the last 3 years social isolation and lockdown.
Well, let's look at it this way. Teenagers have two jobs. Their jobs are to become increasingly independent and to spend as much time with their friends as possible. And those jobs were made impossible by what they went through. And I'll tell you, Mel, I saw a wide range of responses. A few kids, but this isn't a sign that this was a good thing, were glad to be home, were, anxious about school. Very, very small minority of kids felt some relief under lockdown. But
Yeah.
we now have the reality that they do need to return to the world at large, and that's harder than it was before. Most kids just suffered through it, found their way one way or another while feeling miserable. I mean, they were miserable. And, miserable in all of its variety. Some incredibly anxious about what was happening with their social lives, some, unable to do school in 2D. That is its own, fascinating universe of kids who were otherwise very strong students. And I saw several of these really, as long as they were in a bricks and mortar school, could do school. And as soon as it was collapsed into a 2D space, were actually incapable. And it got me thinking, you can hear I get excited about the phenomenology of this. It got me thinking about, oh, we never knew that so much of what kept some kids organized at school was moving physically from room to room.
Yes.
So, oh, I must be in this class now because I'm sitting next to the kid I sit next to in this class. I'm going to focus on this class. Or that they knew that it was time to get out their notebook because everyone around them was getting out their notebook, or they knew that it was time to start writing down notes because they're noticing people doing it. I just became completely fascinated by all of these ancillary supports that we had never thought about because we had never been put in a position to think about. And I watched kids who really were incredibly strong academically crater. I mean, absolutely be completely unable to do school. There were also kids who could do school, they just hated it, and they did it and they hated it. So we saw all of that. And then at the other far limit, and unfortunately we saw way too many kids in this area, I saw kids entirely derailed, right? Who developed horrifying eating disorders, who were smoking, so much weed that it really probably changed their developmental trajectory, at least for a while, who ended up in just rip-roaring social conflicts that, I think were partly to deal with boredom and partly out of desperation and partly out of who knows what. I will tell you, Mel, and from having read my work, I am generally on the kids are resilient, it's all good, we'll find our way through this. And I still believe that, but I can tell you, having been a practicing clinician for a long time, before 2020 March and then post, the stories I hear now of kids derailing are just much, much more extreme than what I used to hear. And that part is alarming to me, and I don't get alarmed very easily.
Wow. What do we need to know? Because, what we saw, which was very interesting, is we saw a lot of grief because our daughters were in the middle of their college experience. And so there was daily ricocheting emotion about policies changing? Are we going back? Are we not going back? Who's going back? Am I going to live off? Like all of that stuff. And then all of those sort of milestones of graduation or prom or all of these things that people look forward to or are just expected being ripped away. And so I saw a lot of that. And I also have lots of friends whose kids just opted out of school, who started smoking pot, who became incredibly rebellious, who became super depressed, eating disorders, re-triggered. And so I think we've all, if it's not happened in our family, we have somebody close to us who is going through it. And what do you want us, first of all, to know about how not being able to do the two things you're supposed to do, which is become more independent and spend more time with your friends, how does that impact a child developmentally?
I think the best language for this is to think in terms of delay, not loss. Though there's
Okay.
a lot of loss. And, like what your daughters, like they lost elements of college that they're never getting back. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
needs to be acknowledged as exactly what it is. But in terms of developing a sense of independence, finding one's path and one's interests, developing one's peer relationships and increasing reliance on peer relationships and moving out into the peer world, we just have to accept that there's a delay in that. And there's no getting around the fact that there's a delay. I really do think that development isn't like the most powerful force in the world, and kids will find their way back onto a trajectory that works for them. I really do know that humans as a group bend towards health. But sometimes I think it's hard for us to accept that there are delays. And I have sometimes found myself in conversations where people are hand-wringing about, how kids look academically, which we are still seeing the aftermath academically. And I say to them, okay, but wouldn't it be so weird if kids didn't go to school for a year and a half and they came back and we saw no impact from that? We would
That's
have been
true.
thinking, like, what
That's
have we
true.
been doing all this time, requiring them to show up for school? So we just have to say they're going to be delayed because they missed out. And that language, I think, is better than a lost language. I also think we got to look for the big stuff. So we had talked about suicidality. Let's just hit it head on because
Yep.
it's the scariest thing. So it is true, Mel, that thoughts of suicide are actually not rare. That I don't have the statistics at my fingertips, but I know that when we've looked, before 2000, we would take surveys of adolescents and the frequency with which they, the thought had crossed their mind. And it's
Right.
not rare. And I remember being a teenager, and like one time my mom and I were in a fight, and I was like, oh, wouldn't she? Couldn't, if I hurt myself right now, she'd feel so bad, right? So did I think about it? Yes. Was I myself close to doing it? No. Right. So I do want people to know that. If you have a worry about a teenager or anybody in your life around questions of whether they are suicidal, what we recommend as psychologists is you just have to ask. You have to ask. And here's how I would have you do it. I would say to the person, listen, I need to ask you a question, and this may feel out of the blue, something like that. But because of, and then you tell them why, right? You don't just ask randomly. You say, because you've been in your room for a day and a half, or you have not seemed like yourself, or you were so upset about that thing. I
Mm-hmm.
need to ask, have you had any thoughts of harming yourself or ending your life? And the reason we're reluctant to do this is we're afraid we're going to give the person the idea that's a concern. We know that's not a concern. What we do know when we have researched adolescents is if a teenager is thinking about suicide, they're glad you asked. So I think we start with the
Wow.
scariest thing and how to address the scariest thing, and then we can go think down the line of more manageable concerns. But that is the one we just have to address very directly.
Thank you. And it was very reassuring to hear the research that teenagers are just glad you asked.
They're glad you asked.
Yeah, we had
Yeah.
we did a episode with our 18-year-old son now where he disclosed to me on the episode. I did not know that this was the case, that he had had big scary thoughts like that freshman year, and I had no idea.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that was interesting about it is he was pretty surprised to learn that it is frequent and normal to have a thought like that. And there's a big difference between having a thought and actually wanting it to happen. And that they do come and go and they do go away. And it doesn't mean you're at the end of the end, but even just talking about it made him feel better. And so I love that you just gave us permission based on the research to just ask, and they will feel better, even if the thought hadn't even crossed our mind. Thank you for checking in. I would love for you to help us understand some of the issues that you've seen coming out of this, and how to really parse, especially in the wake of the rising crisis that you're seeing. Even if it's just starting to come to the surface, it's sort of even delayed that, now we're kind of through it and quote, back to school and back to this, that there's still this delay and there's still this hangover, so to speak, of the emotional experience. And I'm convinced everybody's nervous system is in fight or flight still.
I'm with you on the nervous system stuff. I mean, that really rocked our world. And when we think about, really hugely unsettling events, they do sort of rewire our nervous system. And I think that we're having to find our way through that. Two things. We are seeing aftermath, and we can be very specific about that. I really worry about eating disorders. I really worry about kids who are abusing substances. We don't know yet what the snapshot of mental health is right this minute for teenagers. And part of what's confusing is that in February of this year, the CDC released a report that was very devastating about adolescent mental health. But what's important about those numbers is that they were collected in the fall of 2021, asking about mood over the previous year.
Oh.
Yeah, that kind of got lost in a lot of the reporting. And I think that's actually a really critically important point, because when I think about the fall of 2021, what we were looking at were kids who were either entering their third school year that was disrupted. They were all entering their third school year. Either they were going back in masks and terrified, or not going back in masks and terrified, or, still hybrid and unhappy. So it was a very particular time. So just to say, we kind of don't know, and we won't know for about another 18 months where we stand now. Anecdotally, and this is important to say, for kids who are back to their regular routines, they look to me like kids did before 2020.
Awesome.
I'm seeing a lot of just typical adolescence, right? Which is also rich and spicy on a good day, but it's typical, right? So, yes. But the things I worry about increased isolation. People spend more time away from one another. I worry about eating disorders in kids of all genders. We have traditionally attached these to girls. That's not actually how it works. And I worry about, we haven't talked about social media. It's a big topic. And I feel like it's way more complicated than just, all good or all bad. I worry about the norms in digital environments where kids hang out. And what I mean by that is that one thing I feel that we definitely saw between March 2020 and then the subsequent years was the kids who were stuck at home, who felt like they were going to use that time to get in shape, right, and improve themselves. So they start searching online for fitness, diet, exercise, anything like that. The algorithms that drive social media pick this up and start to flood their feed with image after image after image of ultra thin or ultra fit, and then how to, lose weight, and here's an advertisement for it. Teenagers are vulnerable to norms. They are more vulnerable to norms than kids are. They are more vulnerable to norms than adults are. And it's hard because we can't prove this with the data, but I will just go out on a limb and say, I am convinced if you are looking at 4,000 images a day of ultra fit, ultra thin people, that impacts real world behavior, and that changes how you eat, and that changes how you exercise. And we did see an explosion of eating disorders. So what I would say is we gotta watch where kids are online now and forever, because the norms are powerful.
I can't agree more. In fact, it happened to our daughter. And I remember when she got into treatment for disordered eating, she ended up deleting her Visco and her Instagram. And I don't even think TikTok was really a thing, because this was back in high school, so it hadn't quite exploded yet. And she said, my entire feed is basically models and waist trainers and puppies. And it makes me feel terrible. And I keep looking at these images and it makes me feel like I like need to get like that. And I know that these are fake. I know there are filters, but I still can't help it. I want to be like that. And so it drove all of this obsessive behavior. Is there also a connection with the spike in eating disorders because it is typically something driven by this need to control?
It's interesting. I wrote a piece for the Times, I think it came out in April 2021, about the spike in eating disorders. And there's a variety of reasons that can come into it. So some is everything feels out of control. Here's one thing I can't control. That can be really powerful. Another that one of the experts I interviewed referenced that I thought was really important is that we had a lot of very hard driving teenagers with a whole lot of energy who suddenly couldn't do the things they usually did, right? Who would have poured their, growth, self-improvement juice into band and sports and all these other things, and who had just a whole bunch of that lying around. And so then they turned it against themselves into, I'm just going to get really fit because I might as well do something to make myself better, finger quote, better in this time. But I do also just think if all you're looking at are ultra thin, ultra fit bodies, and you are not going to school and looking at normal bodies in 3D, your sense of what bodies looks like changes and your view of your own body changes.
I want to ask you a very specific question on this topic because I think there's also this kind of cultural obsession with being in shape and being healthy and being good looking. And if you've got a kid that suddenly goes on a health kick and now they're exercising and they get positive reinforcement because they're looking great and they're now going to run the 5K and now they're going to get in triathlons, or now, everyone's like, oh, you look great in that bathing suit. Where is the line where it's a healthy thing versus this is now something that's scary? And I think we all know when somebody has stopped eating, when they're deteriorating in terms of their weight. But how do you, because I miss the signs.
Yeah.
And kids are also remarkable at just kind of, oh, it's fine. I'm just, and then because it's in this lane of, but they look better, but they're exercising, but they say they're going for a run. How do I insert myself here? How do you do that?
It's tricky, and it is easy to miss. So some framing stuff. One is teenagers shouldn't be losing weight. And usually they're gaining weight in the course of typical development and later puberty, that they're gaining weight and they're gaining strength. So if you notice that your teenager has lost weight, you should be attentive to that. It's just an unusual thing for teenagers to do.
Huh.
And it's not all bad. I mean, you can talk with your pediatrician, and, there are some teenagers who the pediatrician may say, this weight is not in a healthy place. Losing some weight would be a healthier thing to do. Then you can do that with the nutritionist and the pediatrician and do it in a controlled and careful way. But one thing I've learned from my colleagues in the eating disorder world is by the time a teenager is losing weight, something's usually up.
Wow.
And I think that's just a valuable, marker to have. The other thing that we want to watch out for is dropping entire food categories. So I'll put it this way. Not everybody who becomes a vegetarian goes on to develop an eating disorder. Everybody who goes on to developing an eating disorder drops a food category.
Oh my God. I literally just had this conversation with somebody about how it's become, and you say that you said teenagers are so 11 to 25 very impacted by quote norms. And our daughter, the one who did have disordered eating, did a research paper in college about, I don't even remember the name of it, but that there's a lot of people in her age group that are gluten-free or vegan or dairy-free or this, and it is a socially acceptable and praised way to have disordered eating. It's not actually an allergy. It's literally it's crossed a line. Is that what you're talking about?
It's a flag. It's a flag. And one of the ways I sometimes assess that flag is I'll sometimes care for teenagers who are like, I don't eat sugar. And I'll be like, right. And my eyebrows will go up. But if I also know that they don't eat sugar unless somebody brings in some really good cupcakes, I don't worry about it too much.
Okay.
So there's like what people say and what people do. And what we want fundamentally is to see that food is a pleasure, that it is a wonderful source of energy, that there's variety in a young person's diet and in any of our diets. So those are some flags to keep an eye out for. And then I would say if concerns really start to rise, we can actually go back to where we started around people having two sides. And it's the job of all of us, and teenagers are developing in their capacity, to take good care of ourselves. That's our job. And so if a teenager is suddenly eating nothing but celery and running, a lot, that kid is not taking good care of themselves. And so before it gets to that extreme, I would want the loving person in their life to say, hey, I see that you're getting pretty fit, but I'm not so sure you're taking good care of yourself. Are you taking good care of yourself? Are you eating the kind of variety of nutrition? Are you being gentle enough on your body? Like exercise, yeah, but not to the point of injury, to use that as a guardrail. That fundamentally, that's the goal, is for the teenager to be doing a really, really excellent job of caring for themselves.
Today, you're going to meet Dr. Lisa Damour. And if you thought the last 3 years in lockdown impacted you,